thank you for such a detailed introduction. And of course, most of the things that you mentioned are initiatives that Peace Action has championed and that were successful because of the grassroots activism of Peace Action, your hard work, your leadership, the organization's relentless efforts, especially to stop the war in Yemen, to push for a peaceful resolution on North Korea, and so many other initiatives. So I'm extremely grateful, and you're right, I'm very lucky to have a great staff with Gio Sama and Kate Gold and Heather Purcell, who all put human rights and dignity at the center of their work and approach to politics. I wanted to talk today about three concrete areas of what we're working on: the Peace Act, the Pentagon budget cuts that are necessary, and preventing funding for the modernization of ICBMs. The Peace Act is long overdue. Every other Western democracy, particularly in Europe, has a standard of force consistent with human rights law. And that is that force can only be used when it is absolutely necessary and a last resort. In the United States, we still have a standard governed by William Rehnquist's 1989 opinion, where he says that police officers can use force if they think it is reasonable. And this has led to the lack of accountability of police officers. When you look at the case of Mr. Brooks in Atlanta and the shooting, I mean, that was not a case where force was absolutely necessary. It was not a case where they waited to use force until a last resort. Their argument is that the officer thought it was reasonable. But my view, and the view of international human rights, is that that is not a judgment that should be made by officers, that every de-escalatory technique and every technique to avoid the use of deadly force should be used before we have the officer allowed to do that. And so we had introduced this with Lacey Clay almost a year ago at the 5-year anniversary of Ferguson. And we had very few co-sponsors at the time, maybe 22 to 24. And now we have 85 co-sponsors. There has been, because of people on the streets, because of all of the activism, a sea change in Congress about the need to change the standard of force and comply with human rights law. And so I'm very optimistic it will make it through the House. And then the question is, will the Senate take it up? But these are the types of changes, this and getting rid of qualified immunity for officers and making sure that we are banning certain practices. These are the types of real substantive reform we need, more than just words. I'm glad that the Police and Justice and Policing Act is basically taking up the Peace Act in its entirety, and that we will hopefully get a vote on the floor of the House. The only complication is if the Senate tries to water it down. So as we continue to advocate, as we talk with members of Congress, we need to emphasize that complying with the international human rights standard of force is one critical aspect to that issue. The Pentagon budget, where as you referenced, I'm on the House Armed Services Committee. And let's just put this in perspective. Barack Obama left having increased the defense budget at $600 billion, around $600 billion. It is now $738 billion. It's $138 billion more than when Obama left the White House. So when we talk about the strategic cuts in defense and the type that Bernie Sanders has proposed, the type that we will be proposing to further fund free public college, to further fund universal child care, to fund basic investments, we aren't talking about something that outside the mainstream. What we're saying is, why aren't we returning to the levels of budgets that Obama had offered? And it is in that context, particularly with coronavirus, where we have seen that we need an expanded definition of national security, that the average person faces a much bigger threat from pandemics, from the risk of climate change, than they do from traditional, often great power politics. And yet we have totally underinvested in our public health infrastructure, in our advocacy on the Green New Deal and tackling climate change. But those are national security issues. So we are going to be introducing amendments to redirect a lot of the traditional Pentagon funding, which is going to more aircraft carriers, which is going to a larger Space Force, and putting that into initiatives in education, in the environment, in public health, that actually is going to make our nation more competitive, that will make us stronger and more resilient in the 21st century. And a key component of that is preventing the modernization of ICBMs. I had a great call with Secretary Bill Perry, who I know is familiar to people here, and Secretary Muniz, as well as Sam Nunn. And their view is that the ICBMs pose the biggest risk for a nuclear confrontation. For one reason, you can't take an ICBM back if there is an incorrect order to launch. I mean, if you have a launch that's incorrect with an Air Force bomber or with a submarine, you can at least call that back. With an ICBM, you can. And so the risk of accidental war are potentially catastrophic with an ICBM. And we have all of the capacity we need with the Air Force and the submarine to have deterrence, to make sure that there is nuclear deterrence. So why we would spend extraordinary resources to modernizing the ICBM when we ought to be phasing out the ICBM is counterproductive to a deterrence. It's not necessary for a deterrence. And it is putting us at greater risk of an accidental nuclear war. Secretary Perry believes it's one of the most destabilizing threats to the world for us to be having these ICBMs. So our amendment is going to say that we should stop any funding that is going to the modernization of these ICBMs and put that money instead in coronavirus, tackling coronavirus and public health research and coronavirus research, so that we're actually addressing the threat that people are facing today, and that we aren't furthering the risk of nuclear war, which is still at a very, very high likelihood chance. I mean, it's one of the most dangerous times that we have not, as a nation, been able to reduce that risk compared to where it was at the height of the Cold War. And we certainly should be able to do that. And so that is a very high priority. Let me end, because I want to save some time for questions, in talking about Martin Griffiths, who wrote to me and is very optimistic that there may be some peace agreement in Yemen in the near future. Martin Griffiths, of course, is the UN ambassador, UN special envoy to Yemen. And that was so heartening that finally, in the midst of this pandemic, it looks like there may be a ceasefire. It looks like there may be a lifting of the blockade. It looks like we finally can get food and medicine into that region. And I'm eagerly awaiting what happens there. But all of your efforts, the pressure that we put to get the War Powers Resolution, to get the administration to voluntarily suspend the refueling, to start putting pressure on the Saudis, all of that has made a difference. And Martin Griffiths, in my view, deserves to the Nobel Peace Prize if he's able to successfully conclude this awful, horrendous war. And so I am in touch with him and continuing to engage with Congress on what we can do to support him as he tries to bring a resolution to the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of our time. I want to save the remaining time we have to answer any questions that you may have and what's on your mind and your agenda.
I think you're muted. Sorry.
We're just waiting on Jim.
Yeah, I'm trying to, did it go? It didn't get there yet?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thank you, Representative Khanna. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. This is tremendous, and it shows not only your great appreciation for us, but also just want to note that we recognize your great work. I'd like to have some questions come forward, and I see in the chat box. Here's one that I'll just give to you at this moment. It's regarding the chokehold and the tactics that are being used in Israel Defense Forces and police forces regularly. So we know that there's concern around that, but I guess for what we would like you to answer, what is your read concerning chokeholds and all of the issues that are being presented for changing the police? And what is your read on Capitol Hill, and what would be some things you would suggest we need to take note of?
I think on chokeholds, there is a broad consensus, including, frankly, some Republicans, that it is a practice that needs to simply be outlawed. Everyone saw how gruesome that can be, and how unnecessary it is. And so I think that is definitely going to be part of the House bill. I think there's a chance it could even be part of the Senate bill. And my view is it should just be an outlawed practice. But I think we have to go beyond that, because even if we get to outlawing chokeholds, I think unless we address the systematic racism that exists in law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and find ways to tackle that, and unless we address the standard of force issue and police officers being immune from liability, then we won't really have a comprehensive solution. So yes, we need to outlaw chokeholds, but it has to be much broader than that.
Okay. Another question in from Gene Hasey. Can you talk a little bit about the new supersonic weapon?
Again, I have to look into that with greater detail in terms of what that would entail, and any funding of it. In the past, I've been skeptical of some of the Space Force and the additional funding for efforts that I haven't seen as necessary, but I would need to look more into that specific issue.
Great. What messages do you think resonate best with your Republican colleagues in terms of politics, in terms of police and military grade equipment?
Again, I think I had a conversation with Mike Gallagher, as a Republican representative from Wisconsin, and he said that he would be open to not having military equipment go to police, and getting the militarized weapons off of our streets and not to police forces. The other thing is, we ought to be talking about gun violence in the context of this reform. I mean, one of the things that would help is to get these guns that are weapons of war off our streets, as well as we seek to reduce violence in our society. But I definitely think there's actually even Republicans who would be sympathetic to the idea that should not have military equipment being used by police officers.
Indeed. Any chance of removing money from the new submarines? For the new submarines, any chance?
Yeah, we're looking at that. That's part of the proposal in Sanders' case to not have that funding. And I certainly think that they have to justify why they need all of this additional funding, and especially when we're underfunding public health, underfunding education, underfunding research on vaccines and diseases. So my view is that we need to do that. Our focus is to prevent the funding of ICBM modernization.
And another question is, I know we got about a minute left. Can you share your thinking on about why you supported the anti-BDS legislation?
So I appreciate that, and it's a very difficult issue, and I totally respect the rights of protesters, and I understand the injustices there. I just think that the most effective way is, first of all, I would never support anything that would criminalize it or that would suppress the right of protest. But I think that the most effective way for us to get a two-state solution, a peaceful solution, and a Palestinian state, and the recognition of human rights is to build a broad coalition of people to do that. And I don't think that the BDS movement would enable that broad coalition. That said, my role as a member of Congress is different than the role of an activist, and I certainly don't believe that the government should in any way infringe on activists' rights to pursue their conscience.
I know we have less than a minute, and I'll give you this quick question, and I'll save the rest to get to you. What are the chances of any legislation on police reform getting past Mitch McConnell?
I think the chances are high. The problem is how diluted it will be. I mean, we're going to get police reform. The question is the police reform going to be real? Is it going to be structural? Is it going to just be cosmetic, like the president's executive order, or is there going to be some teeth to it? And I think that is what we have to watch. There's going to be a bill called police reform that passes the House and the Senate, and likely that the president signs. But does it actually advance this issue in changing the standard of force? Does it change the mens rea requirement to prosecute officers? Does it change qualified immunity so officers would be subject to lawsuits? Does it change the diversity of police forces and the need to have a de-escalation and greater diversity? I mean, those are the things that we need to be looking at as this bill advances.
Again, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us. We know you are a champion, and we're champions for the cause that you stand on behalf that connects us all at home and abroad. We will be seeing you when we hit the lobby next week, and we'll be supporting you while you support Forward Movement for Humanity. I want to thank you. This is an awesome moment. And again, folks, knew we didn't come to lobby you, but we appreciate you breaking bread verbally with us. And just stay strong.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you for your moral leadership, for your courage, and to all of your members. You are really pushing for a better world, for a more decent and just society. And I applaud your courage, your conviction, your time. And I'm standing with you for many years to come in this initiative and endeavor that's going to take a lot of work, because we have a lot of work to do to make us have a more just foreign policy.
And thank you again. They said about the climate march, it takes everybody. This takes everybody. We're with you because we know you're with us. Peace be with you.
Thank you.